All right, welcome back to session 8 of lecture series number 5, evaluating leadership, part of strategic leadership and the MBA course. We started out this lecture series, sessions 1, 2, and 3, by looking at the FQM balance scorecard and then looking at strategic maps. We then went a completely different direction. We started to look at more creative ways in which we could evaluate our leadership, such as evaluating the trait theory and the scientific approach mindset to leadership and being more inclusive and being open to other things, looking at burnout in the previous session and so on. We're now returning to some models, and we're going to finish off here because the next session is going to be a case study. We're going to be looking at the force field analysis. All right, so the 4 tools that I'm giving you, which is commonly used, is the FQM, the balance scorecard, strategy maps, and now the force field analysis. So we're returning to a traditional tool as we kind of finish off this evaluation. As I said, the next session will be the case study, session 9, and then session 10 will be, as always, linking the theory here that we've discussed in evaluating leadership to our assessment. So let's get stuck in. Don't forget, we are evaluating the impact of our leadership. We're thinking about all these learning outcomes and ways in which we can now pause and think, right, have I done it? Am I a good leader? Is the environment reflecting my good leadership? So we are evaluating leadership. We're going to be using force field analysis. Let's get stuck in. So there we have it. We've looked at all these different kinds of subjects. The first 3 sessions were these tools. We've then gone into the dark triad. We've gone into the trait theory, looking at indigenous knowledge, how to do behavioral modification. We've looked at stress and burnout. There's loads of other subjects that we could have gone into to evaluate leadership from a more kind of creative point of view, right? What we see in terms of the culture of the organization. But those were the key ones that I wanted to emphasize. That's Trevor doing Trevor's thing. But we're going to finish here with force field analysis, which is another final tool. Again, this comes from Krishna in organizational behavior. All right, so let's define this. You may or may not be aware of it. So force field analysis is a decision-making tool that helps identify the factors that support or hinder a proposed change. Now, let's pause for a minute again, right? Senior leaders or leadership, vision, mission, values, right? What we decide those core things, the mission, vision, and values, and then we push that through into objectives and goals of something that we're trying to achieve long term, 5 to 10 years from now. So how do we make those decisions? And therefore, how do we enable that change that needs to take place towards what we're seeking to achieve in 5 or 10 years from now? So the force field analysis helps us to put a spotlight on all of that process. Now, again, FQM works, we could use that. Balance scorecard works, we could use that. We could use strategy maps. This is just another way in which we could analyze and put a spotlight on this process. So, and you'll see a lot of links here to leadership and strategic leadership. So the steps to perform a force field analysis. Number 1, define the goals. Who defines the goals? Leaders do. Right. So again, why I'm looking at this particular tool. So you need to set the objectives and the goals for change. Now, again, this could be used in terms of change management, where a department decides to implement some kind of change and they need to change this. But we're thinking about this strategically. So the change that needs to be, achieving something in 5 or 10 years from now, right? Which is what strategy is. Strategy is always long term. We then list the forces. So we create a list of the forces that might support this going forward. Again, you could combine this with a balance scorecard, the stakeholders involved, for example, but as well those that would oppose the change, right? And again, thinking about some of the stuff we thought about, paradigms, is it scientific, is it indigenous? We could think about stress and that would cause in terms of resistors, all those kind of things. Then we want to score the forces, right? Assign a score to each force on a scale of 1 to 5. Obviously, 1 being weak, 5 being, right, this is going to really have a big influence. Therefore, we clearly need to prioritize the 5s and deal with the 5s. We then add up those columns, and we can also then see whether there is stronger supporting forces or opposing forces. And again, it allows us to make prioritized decisions in terms of pushing things forward. So we use the analysis to decide whether to move forward with the change or to identify ways to strengthen the supporting forces and weaken the opposing forces in order to move forward with the change. All right, good tool, right? So let's look at what this looks like. All right, so here we have a visualization, two different visualizations of what this could look like. On the left-hand side, and this is based on Kurt 11, by the way, the driving forces, so the positive changes, the restraining forces, and of course, presently where we are and the kind of things we want to do. Now, what you'll notice on the right-hand side, gives you the different kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it allows you to actually see, and the arrows, you can see the arrows are different sizes indicating it. So the driving force on the left-hand side is a 4, right? So it's a very high one. They're not quite using 1 to 5 here, are they? The next one is 2, the next one is 3, the next one is 1. So if you add these up, so that's 4, that's 6, 9, that's 10. It equals 10 in terms of the driving forces. Looking at the restraining, we've got 3, 6, 7, that's 10. So it's equal driving versus equal restraining. So how do we increase the driving? How do we decrease the restraining? Because they're equal, right? There's an equal force on both sides. Now, again, you could write on each of the arrows what that force is, so you could clearly define these. And again, you can then target how to increase that or how to decrease that. So a helpful tool in driving through that change, and again, evaluating. Now, once we've made these decisions, this is then when we can evaluate the impact of our leadership. Right, so here's a more detailed way to think of this. So some examples here. So in the middle, upgrade the factory with new manufacturing machinery. So this might be a digital kind of process. We need to modernize, we need to automate, and this needs to happen now. Manufacturing industry, clearly, in terms of a factory. So the forces for change, you'll notice they're 4, 2, 3, 1, the scoring, total 10. But the forces against is a little bit higher, it's 11. So two decisions. Do we go ahead with it, right? Because the restraining forces are higher, i.e., we know what we're in for here. Or, right, now that we know what to expect before we started, how could we increase the support? How could we decrease the resistance? Right, so pre-work is done before this is then launched and done. Now, when I used to run charities and I used to come in because I needed to turn things around, this is one of the key things that I did almost kind of unconsciously, is how could I increase the support I do have, put them onto leadership, for example, but knowing what the resistors are, how could I address those resistors and reduce the amount of influence? And in this particular case, I had a guy called Harold, who always resisted things. He was a bit of Malcolmism, did it behind my back, but I discovered it, found out about it, led a toddler group with his wife, got her on side, and that's how I controlled Harold. So I reduced the resistance by using his wife to keep him in tow, basically. All right, so there's means and ways in which you can deal with this. Now that's small, there was like an organization of 50 or so, and a leadership of 6. When you get into big organizations, it becomes a lot more complex. Another example on the right-hand side, seek advice from experts or authorities on how to comply with regulations. So they're clearly updating their regulatory structures within the company. Again, customer demand, new contracts, etc. They again rating it. So the driving forces in this case is 16, whereas the opposing forces is 12. So go ahead, just start, go ahead, and then increase the driving forces, but work on targeting what you need to reduce in terms of the resisting forces. So a nice tool to be able to push through these things. Again, the evaluating the leadership is the quality of these decisions that are being made and the quality of the strategies being implemented to deal with this. In terms of resistance, I found this just a helpful slide for you to think about. There are 4 ways in which resistance normally manifests in terms of change. You've got COVID, so this is happening without you realizing it, and then you've got over, it's in your face, you know it's happening. You've then got people who are doing it, but they're unaware they're doing it. They're not aware that they're an opposing force. And then there's people who are very aware they are opposing this. Believe it or not, X marks the spot. X is where you want things to be happening. So if you're having open meetings to discuss changes with the staff or the students or the customers, X is where you want things to be. You want people to be overt. You want them to say things out loud, and you want them to come out and say it, and not to be punished for that, not to be reprimanded. The more you know how to deal with it, right? So you know what the opposing forces are. The difficulty is the survivor. So these are people that are resisting. They are unaware that they're resisting. You are unaware that they are resisting. And therefore you cannot deal with these opposing forces because you're unaware of it. And they are unaware of it, right? They're the survivors. Does not realize they are undermining the change. So you clearly want to avoid the survivors. You want to bring people into what's called the protesters, the pain in the necks, the heralds, because then at least you know how to deal with it. The saboteur is somebody who does it behind your back. So this is Malcolmism. And then the zombie is somebody who, this is more about capability. So they verbally agree, but they don't actually have the capability to do anything. So you don't want to invest in them in terms of reducing the resistance, because actually the resistance is not really influencing anything. And you don't want to invest in them in terms of support either. They lack capability. They're not actually adding anything to the occasion. Right. So that's a really helpful diagram just to kind of picture all of that. This is the change cycle. It's based on the Kubler-Ross crisis cycle. So normally what happens when we go through something, say, and this Kubler-Ross, Dr. Kubler-Ross, she worked with cancer patients. And what she realized is that they all went through a very similar cycle, which is when she created the Kubler-Ross crisis cycle. So when somebody found out that they had a terminal illness, the first thing was denial. I can't believe this. I just can't believe this, right? You hear that in the way in which it's coming out. That's denial. Once they've then accepted that this is what's happened, they're angry, right? So if they're religious, they blame God. If they're not religious, they'll blame, family, health, whatever, right? They'll lash out. It's normal. It's natural. There's anger. After the anger, there's bargaining. Again, if they're religious, they promise to become a nun or a monk or whatever, right? Just save me from this. There's all kinds of bargaining. I will this, if this, and this kind of thing. They then, after this, accepting that this is where it's going, that acceptance leads to kind of anxiety, sadness, depression. I'm terminally ill. And it's only after that they then, after this complete acceptance, right, and they've hit this anxiety, depression, do they then begin to, make plans, for example, or they begin to fight, right? And that's when they begin to test, and then the acceptance comes out on the other end. So in terms of organizational change, we can see the same thing. So the opposing forces is the sense of denial. Can't believe the leaders are making this decision. I can't believe, right? That's denial. Then, I'm really annoyed that they are doing this. They're really messing up the company. That's the anger being expressed. Now, the interesting thing about Kubler-Ross is that until you go through one stage, you can't get to the next one, right? So some people, they go through these phases very quickly and they get to the testing phase. Others take their time, and you can literally see them going through the phases. But sometimes what happens is they loop back again. So where the bargaining is not happening, they then get angry again. Then they try and bargain something else, and that doesn't work. So they get angry again because they don't want to go past the bargaining. So you end up in this kind of loop, right? And you never get over something. This is when people have baggage. They've never completed the cycle. They've never got to the acceptance phase. So it's a helpful little diagram to think about change within organizations, particularly when the change is quite disruptive, technology, a merger, an acquisition, those kinds of things. So another diagram just to kind of show the change process when you're executing a change. So in the beginning, particularly if there's trust and it's good leadership, there's an uninformed optimism. Okay, we get that you're trying to change things. That's fine. We're with you. Let's see what happens. Then they realize the consequences. People might lose jobs. We might need more work. So then it becomes informed pessimism. Like, oh my goodness, right? And then two things happen. Either there's a public checkout. So the overt, conscious, I'm not going to be part of this. This is rubbish. This is going to just be destructive, and they publicly let you know they're checking out, they're leaving. And again, decision gets made here. Do you try and keep them? Are they worth keeping, or do you let them go? They're not going to add any value if they stay. Just let them go. That's fine. That loss is worth the loss. Or there's a private checkout. Now, quite often it's the private checkout, which actually is somebody who's very competent and who actually does have a lot of value. And the reason why they're doing it privately is because they're great people. They don't want to upset the cartwheel. For some reason, they just don't quite connect with what's happening and the change that's coming, but they don't want to make issues, and so they just privately begin to take steps back. Right? Now, again, if a leader is not consciously aware of what's going on, particularly in a change process, they might lose really good people, which they could have prevented from leaving. And it's quite often the private checkout people. Those that do stay then go into hopeful realism, informed optimism, and then the project goes into completion, and we see a new kind of company or a new kind of process in place. And again, this takes a long time. You can see the time continuum at the bottom of the diagram. So if we put this all back into kind of a diagram, kind of combining the Kubler-Ross crisis cycle and this optimism, pessimism kind of process, we have the starting process. So, you know, people are now making contact with the change that's coming. There's an unawareness of exactly what this means. So we're not quite sure what's happening yet. Then all of a sudden, bang, we now become aware of what's happening, right? And so for some, there might be anger, denial, bargaining, you know, this level of confusion, all this kind of stuff. The negative perception, so the resistors kick in. It might be overt, it might be covert, it might be conscious, might be unconscious. And it then goes, you know, so those that are supporting are in yellow. So, you know, contact awareness, understanding, positive perception, and they're going along with it, they're installing. But the bits that are in white in the box, these are the people that are struggling along the way, which we might lose through public exits or private exits, right? So unawareness, there's confusion, negative perception, decision not to implement. There's your resistors. And then, you know, if the majority, so if the force field is a majority, this kind of resistance, your change won't work. A change will be aborted. But if the positive bit is being worked on and there's a bit of a larger majority, you'll adopt it and it becomes part of the new focus, you know, the new way in which the company operates in terms of that change. So the entire change management process, so starting with the force field analysis, thinking about that, so the strategic decision making on how to implement this change, increase the positive, decrease the negative, dealing with all the resistors that come along, understanding that it's a cycle. Not everyone's going to be 100% on board, and you've got to work with those. You've got to target, you've got to work. You're going to lose some, you're going to keep some. You want to keep those that are really valuable to the organization, make it worth their while to stick it out. And then work your way through the entire process. When you come out at the end, it's an evaluation of your leadership. So how successful were you in implementing a change that is for everyone's benefit, not toxic leaders, not just about you and your status, but everyone's benefit? Who have you kept and how have you managed that process all the way through? It's a really good sign of leadership. I often got involved in companies for 2 or 3 years, walked them through a process, and often arrived at a place where I've implemented that change. I've kept the core people on board. I've changed things in the time process, quite often the leadership, and it's now in a place where somebody else needs to come in and institutionalize it, right? Which is right there at the top. I'm not a caretaker. I bring about change, and then you need a caretaker who then makes that part of the institutional process. Now, interestingly enough, when I worked for a particular charity, I did this entire thing. But what we did wrong is succession planning. We brought in another change agent. So rather than them institutionalizing all the stuff I did, they closed that charity down and combined it with another one in a completely different area. So all of that work that had been done for the 3-year process was lost. But that, yeah, as angry and as frustrated as I was that this happened, I had a big role in bringing this person on board. And what I brought in is a change agent rather than somebody who would institutionalize. The Americans use the term settlers and pioneers, right? I'm a pioneer. And once a pioneer's finished their work, you need a settler to come in, somebody who caretakes and institutionalizes those changes, rather than bringing in another change agent, because then change never gets institutionalized. And we see this quite often in public sector organizations like the NHS. There's too many change agents, and we don't actually get settlers in who then institutionalize those changes, so that you can have a period of settle, so that you can evaluate to then make the next decision. But we never allow things to settle, and actually we don't know whether it did or didn't work, because we've got a new set of initiatives that are coming in again. So the force field analysis is a really good model to kind of zone in on that decision-making process, zoning in on supporting and opposing forces, so that at the end we can then evaluate whether actually something has, improved or not improved, which will lead us to the next decision. Excellent. So that's it. We're now going to come back for session 9. We're going to look at a case study, and then I'm going to link everything back into the assessments.